The untold story of Ted Williams and the baseball team that helped win World War II. It sounds impossible. A baseball legend, a group of athletes, and a global war that consumed continents. Yet this story is real. On the morning of May 6, 1942, less than 5 months after Pearl Harbor, a young man stood on the tarmac at Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida. He was not holding a bat. He was holding flight orders. His name was Theodore Samuel Williams, already the most feared hitter in Major League Baseball. Little did the fans cheering in Fenway Park know that the men they admired from the bleachers would soon fight a very different battle, one not measured in runs or averages, but in survival, sacrifice, and national survival. What happened next would become legendary. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the nation mobilized at a scale never seen before. Factories converted overnight, young men lined up at recruitment centers, and professional sports, America's great escape, faced an existential question. President Franklin Roosevelt, in what became known as the Green Light Letter, allowed baseball to continue, but that decision came with a cost. More than 500 Major League players would eventually leave the game to serve. Among them were names that echoed through stadiums: Joe DiMaggio, Bob Feller, Hank Greenberg, and Ted Williams. Williams was not drafted. He volunteered. In May 1942, he entered the U.S. Navy Reserve, later transferring to the U.S. Marine Corps, determined to become a combat pilot. At the same time, an extraordinary experiment was taking shape. Across the country, baseball players were being funneled into military units, not for morale alone, but for training, discipline, and leadership. These men would form an unofficial team, scattered across bases from California to Florida, bound not by uniforms, but by purpose. By 1943, the war had intensified. In Europe, Allied forces bled in North Africa. In the Pacific, island after island was contested yard by yard. At Naval Air Station Pensacola, Williams trained alongside future legends like Johnny Pesky and Dom DiMaggio. The days began before dawn: physical drills, navigation theory, gunnery instruction. The margin for error was razor thin. Training accidents were common. In 1943 alone, the U.S. military lost over 13,000 airmen in non-combat accidents. By 1,400 hours, the Florida heat turned cockpits into ovens, sweat-soaked flight suits. Fear gripped the men, not of the enemy, but of failing the test that could send them home in disgrace. Williams struggled. His eyesight was legendary at the plate, but landing a fighter aircraft on a short runway required a different precision. Instructors questioned whether the slugger would make it. Little did they know that the same patience that made him a hitter would soon save his life. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the war machine demanded pilots fast. Baseball players trained not just as pilots, but as officers, teaching discipline, teamwork, and resilience to thousands of recruits. They were no longer athletes, they were weapons, and the war was about to test them. By 1944, Ted Williams earned his wings as a Marine Corps fighter pilot, assigned to VMF 311, flying the F-4U Corsair, one of the most lethal aircraft in the Pacific. The Corsair was powerful, fast, and unforgiving. Its engine produced over 2,000 horsepower. One mistake on takeoff or landing could mean death. Williams deployed to the Pacific Theater. The environment was brutal: heat, humidity, disease, Japanese anti-aircraft fire that tore through the sky without warning. On the ground, other ball players faced their own hell. At Omaha Beach, former minor leaguers landed under machine gun fire. In Italy, artillery pounded positions for 3 brutal hours at a time. Casualties mounted. By mid-1944, over 12,000 American airmen had been killed. Williams flew combat missions over enemy territory. Tracer rounds flashed past his cockpit. Engines screamed at full throttle. For just 200 yards, enemy fire tracked his descent on one mission, forcing an emergency landing with a dead engine. Against impossible odds, he survived. Others did not.
The baseball team that had once filled scorecards now filled casualty lists. As the war turned to the Allies' favor, the role of these men evolved. Baseball players became instructors, leaders, symbols of endurance. Williams himself narrowly avoided death when his Corsair was hit during a mission. He limped back to base on sheer determination. In 1945, the war ended. Ted Williams returned home, thinner, hardened, changed. He would later serve again in Korea, flying 39 combat missions, this time under the command of John Glenn. The war had forged something stronger than athletic greatness. It forged resolve. These men didn't win the war alone, but they trained those who did. They inspired millions. They carried the weight of command and never asked for applause. What happened next would become legendary, not on the battlefield, but in memory.
Ted Williams returned to baseball in 1946 and hit .342, winning the American League MVP. But the war never left him. Across America, over 400 professional baseball players never returned to the game. Some never returned home. Medals were awarded, Distinguished Flying Crosses, Air Medals, Purple Hearts. Yet the greatest legacy was unseen: leadership under fire, calm in chaos, brotherhood forged in war. These men proved that heroism does not end at the edge of a field. They had stepped away from fame when the nation needed them most. The story of Ted Williams is not just a baseball story. It is a story of duty, a reminder that behind the statistics were men willing to risk everything, in cockpits filled with smoke, on beaches soaked with blood, in training fields far from cheering crowds. Fear gripped the men, but they flew anyway. Against impossible odds, they served. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to Past Horizon as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.